Good afternoon and welcome to the discussion of Prop 61, the California Drug Price Relief Act, also called State Prescription Drug Purchases. I am joined on the pro side by Gary South to my right from the Gary South Group, and on the no side by Kathy Fairbanks from BCF Public Affairs. We are going to begin with 1-minute opening statements, and we'll begin with you, Gary.
Thank you. Prop 61, which again is the California Drug Price Relief Act, is the only ballot measure in the entire United States of America in the year 2016 that deals with drug prices. As such, the entire country is watching California to see if the voters are willing to stand up against the pharma greed and threats that we all see every day. I don't have to go into the outrageous pricing abuses that the drug companies are perpetrating on people and endangering people's lives with. This is a very simple measure that simply would say that the state of California, as the main purchaser of drugs in California, would have to buy drugs at no more than the lowest price paid for that same drug by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, why DVA? Because DVA, under federal law, pays the lowest prices of any agency, federal or state. We believe California ought to be able to harness its collective buying power to do something about the increasing and outrageously escalating prices of drugs, and that's what Prop 61 would do.
Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I understand people are concerned about drug prices, and it's very easy to rail against the industry, and Gary will do a lot of that today. But the issue is whether Proposition 61 is actually going to do anything. It won't. And it's not just us and the 200 groups opposed to Proposition 61 who are saying that. It's independent experts like the Legislative Analyst Office of California, which has said that Prop 61 could result in the state paying higher drug prices and called Prop 61 highly uncertain. CalPERS also evaluated 61 and worried that it could lead to decreased access to medicines for CalPERS members. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs is worried that Prop 61 could increase its costs for drugs by $3.8 billion annually. And HIV and AIDS groups like Los Angeles LGBT Center, AIDS Project LA, San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and Project Inform have also raised red flags about Prop 61's efficacy and whether it will result in unintended consequences.
This has been titled by Ballotpedia, quote, the most expensive measure on the ballot in 2016, largely because of the money coming in on the no side. A quick check with one of my favorite websites, Voters Edge, showed that on the yes, spending is around $15 million, and on the no, it's about $123 million. The top 10 funders on the no side are, in fact, drug companies, but we've just had the discussion around the condoms and porn measure, Prop 60, and I'm not saying there's any relation to this discussion, but one of the interesting things that's similar is many of the editorial boards, as in that measure, as in this one, are coming out against Prop 61. For reasons that are in some ways not all that ennobling, quite frankly, of the drug industry. I wanted to make a quote from the LA Times and then have you speak to it, Gary. Quote, as much as Prop 61 sponsors rail about drug makers' greed, they assume that the same avaricious companies will do nothing in response to the squeeze on the industry's profits. That's either naive or magical thinking. So many of the editorial boards in coming out against this measure, because it seeks to gauge prices off of the VA price rate, are concerned about the fact that the drug companies are, if passed, are just going to then raise prices to the VA to compensate. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yes, I can, because the answer is quite simple. Despite all the vets ads you've seen on the air, sponsored by the $106 million that these folks have spent, which, by the way, is an all-time record in California history for spending on a ballot measure, involve vets, claiming that somehow if Prop 61 passes, individual vets are going to be harmed by this. Let me make 2 points, all right? This is verifiable fact. The Department of Veterans Affairs does not get the lowest drug prices out of the goodness of the hearts of the drug companies because they have very little goodness in their hearts, if you watched what they do. It is under federal law. Federal law requires DVA to get the lowest price point of any federal agency. Secondly, on the end of vets themselves, most vets don't pay anything for their prescription drugs. If you have a service-related injury, you get your care from DVA lifetime for free. For those who do have non-service-related maladies or illnesses or problems, their copays are capped at $8 a month per drug and $960 per year out of pocket. That's it. This lie that they've perpetrated, that somehow this is going to screw veterans, is just one of the many lies that they've told about Prop 61. But it is really the most ridiculous, because they simply can't go to DVA and rip up the contracts and willy-nilly raise
Right.
prices. And by the way, this is just a threat. Prop 61 would not raise prices for anybody. When Kathy says it would, the it is not 61. The it is the people she's representing
you.
that are
Thank you.
paying her to be
Problem,
on
though.
the stage.
I just want to make the point. There are a number of television commercials with veterans groups being
Absolutely.
represented, and it certainly is the theme that it's not necessarily a threat so much as a understanding on the part of many of these editorial boards that
Right.
it would adversely affect veterans.
No, it's a threat. It's a
could
threat.
you?
It's a threat.
Okay, one at a time, Gary. Could you speak to that, please?
I would be happy to speak to that. The concern at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs is that if Proposition 61 is passed, their special discount could be in jeopardy. The VA has looked at 61 and has come to the conclusion that it could increase drug prices for the VA by $3.8 billion. Nothing in Proposition 61 prevents drug prices from going up for the VA. And so you're exactly right. And that's what a lot of the editorial boards, including the LA Times, made that point. Similarly, nothing in Proposition 61 prevents prices for veterans, for copays, for health care, from going up in the future. And if the VA is faced with a $3.6 billion budget hole each year, they're going to have to do something to close that budget hole. And there are two options, really. You've got an option to cut costs, which could mean cutting services to the VA, or you can raise prices and pass the costs along, which could mean an increase in copays. And Proposition 61 can't dictate what the federal government might do someday. That is the concern. And so when veterans groups like the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Vietnam Veterans of America, all have looked at Proposition 61,
Right.
they're on the no side. Their group, in contrast, was paid $50,000 by the Yes on 61 campaign, and lo and behold, they're appearing in ads.
I wonder if you could,
And the vets groups-
Right, Gary,
Okay.
Gary, we're going to go back and forth here.
Okay,
This
good.
is how we're going to do it.
This is my back and forth.
Yes. I wanted to go to your point about the point that she's making, that it doesn't necessarily regulate what the drug companies could do vis-a-vis the VA. You raised the point that those are set separately and really are controlled by relationships between the VA and the drug companies. Could you speak a little bit to that measure? And again, whether it's a threat or a promise or a concern, this idea that if Prop 61 were to go into effect, drug prices would raise first for the vets and then concomitantly for California.
Sure. Let me make the overriding point, which is if drug prices to the Veterans Affairs Department went up, it has nothing to do with Prop 61. It would be the greedy drug companies screwing vets because the state of California passed Prop 61. There's nothing in Prop 61 that has anything to do with raising the prices of drugs for vets through DVA. Secondly, as I said before, the discounts DVA gets are guaranteed by federal law. Kathy's right. We can't control what the federal government does. Federal law controls what the federal government does, and federal law requires discounts to the Department of Veterans Affairs. And despite how much greed the drug companies might have, and it's demonstrated every single day, they simply cannot legally go in and rip up their contracts and raise prices to DVA. It can't be done. It's a false threat.
Could you speak, Kathy, to this point that there isn't that relationship between the relationship to the VA? Because, again, the veteran groups, at least on the television commercials, are really front and center in this discussion.
Right.
Your thoughts about the relationship between drug companies and the VA and how those prices are set, and any possible results that might come from the passage of Prop 61.
Right. Gary's right. There is a federal discount that the VA gets right off the bat. They get a 24% discount off the list price of drugs. However, that is not the final price paid by the VA, and that is not the price tied in Proposition 61. The VA negotiates additional discounts with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and there are estimates that their ultimate discount, the lowest price paid, could be somewhere in the 40% off, if you will. So the $3.8 billion that the VA is worried about losing every year, or costs going up by $3.8 billion, represents the difference between the lowest price they pay and the 24% discount. Again, nothing in Proposition 61 prevents that price from going up, and nothing in Prop 61 can protect veterans.
Gary, I'm sorry.
I mean, go ahead.
So, I just wanted to go back to you, Gary. One of the questions that is raised in editorial board after editorial board is the general subject of transparency in drug prices, and the fact that we don't really know how much the VA is, what kind of discounts they're getting. To Kathy's point, on some drugs it can be up to 40 or 50%. While it may be a regulation at 24%, there are variations within a formulary. Could you speak to the impact then that what's being requested here would not really be the full benefit of the so-called VA discount?
Sure. One of the original lies that the other side was telling was that you couldn't possibly peg state drug prices to DVA prices because they're confidential, they're secret, they're unknowable. We did a FOIA request to DVA itself in January. The response says from DVA itself, who probably know more about it than the drug companies who are funding this no side campaign, that yes, most drug prices paid by DVA are publicly knowable and are available on their website. These are not secret and they're not confidential. I have to say one more thing about vets,
Okay.
right? The vets groups that you've seen on these ads have been paid by the pharma companies. Go to followthedrugdollars.com. Followthedrugdollars.com, and you will see what they did is they bought off the lobbyist for these old-line veterans groups. And basically, he went to these groups that he represents, scared the bejesus out of them, and said, oh, this would be horrible for veterans. You got to do this. And so that's how they got them pulled in. This is a money factor. They have bought off all of these groups, paid for them, paid to get on their slates, paid them fees, bought off their lobbyists, because that's what pharma does. Followthedrugdollars.com. It'll be very enlightening
Kathy,
for
could you speak to this issue of transparency? There seems to be some discrepancy here.
Gary is referring, he says prices are public at the VA. That isn't true. The lowest price paid may not be public, and the legislative analyst pointed that out in its review of Proposition 61 and pointed to that as a problem with the implementation. And the concern of the LAO was that this could result in litigation against the state of California because there's no implementation language in Proposition 61 that dictates how this would work in the real world. So it could be years and years before this is finally settled, costing taxpayers millions of dollars.
Because you'll sue.
And this
one at a time.
CalPERS worried it would get sued. They wrote about that in their analysis.
Who would sue?
Enrollees.
The drug companies.
Enrollees.
No, the drug companies.
I want to get to something else that we haven't spoken about. Number one, Proposition 61 only covers 4.5 million people in California. That's 12% of the population.
We're going to get to that.
Most of everybody else isn't covered. Also, and for the 88% who aren't covered, they could experience cost increases and a cost shift. Again, nothing in Proposition 61 protects consumers in California, or the other 88% who get health care from their employer through Covered California, and who are enrolled in the biggest health care program that was suspiciously exempted from Proposition 61. I want to talk about this because there is a tie-in between 60 and 61. The same group is backing Proposition 61 that is backing Proposition 60, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, AIDS Healthcare Foundation made $800 million in 2015 from selling prescription drugs and operating pharmacies. That's a worldwide number, but they do operate pharmacies and prescribe prescription drugs to patients in California. They are part of the Medi-Cal managed care program here. They exempted Medi-Cal managed care from Proposition 61, meaning that they don't have to comply with their own initiative. So they paid to get it on the ballot. They make money off drugs in California. 80% of their revenue comes from drugs. Yet they drafted an initiative that they don't want to comply with.
Gary, I wonder if you could speak to this access issue. That is another theme in several of the no editorials, that we are actually not talking about all Californians, but 12% who are paid specifically through California healthcare programs, whether it's Medi-Cal or state employees. As Kathy says, it's estimated to be between 4.5 to 5 million people, depending on the count. The thought about that, the access question, but also the possibility that, again, there could be cost shifting to the then majority of Californians who are on employer-based or personal plans.
Who would do that cost shifting? The drug companies. This
Again,
again is a
Proposition
threat.
61
It's
doesn't
again a
protect
threat.
anybody
It's
from
a
it,
threat.
though.
It's a threat. What they're saying
But
is
it's a
that
reality.
if the
Could
voters of
happen.
California pass Prop 61, the drug companies, to keep their obscene profit margins high, will try to screw people who are not benefited by Prop 61 by raising their drug prices. This is all threats, folks. Secondly, let me say this. Access to drugs can be determined in a lot of different ways. It can be determined by availability. If a drug is on a formulary, for example, on Medi-Cal or for CalPERS. But access to drugs is also determined mostly by price. Price, okay? Hepatitis C, which now kills more Americans than the next 16 infectious diseases combined, more than HIV, more than tuberculosis. There is now a cure for Hep C. It's a cure. It will cure you in 3 months, 95% of people who have Hep C. It is not available to most people either through private plans or through Medi-Cal or through Medicare or through CalPERS because the greedy drug company called Gilead Sciences that is here in California in Foster City got control of this formulary and is charging $1,095 for one pill. For one pill. $1,000 per pill.
Right.
As a result of the over 200,000 people in Medi-Cal who have Hep C and whose bodies are being ravaged by Hep C, only 2% of them have been treated with this drug because the greedy drug company that controls it and has the patent for it is price gouging to the point that it's put out of reach for most people who have Hep C.
Thank you,
That's
Gary.
what her clients are doing.
I want to speak to, it appears that you're not able to say drug company without greedy in front of it. I want to speak to this issue of...
It defines
I
itself.
want to speak to this issue of greed and drug pricing and the importance of research. I know the arguments from the drug companies are the profits are all part and parcel of the research and R&D process that they go through, that many drugs that start in the pipeline never make it. There's, there really is an element to that there are immense risks taken by the drug companies. Could you speak to this issue of a $1,900 pill and the fact that, at least from the drug company's perspective, that seeing that just purely as profit does not really tell the whole story?
No, it doesn't tell the whole story about Proposition 61. And I think Gary is holding that up as an example and saying Proposition 61 is going to solve this problem. The independent expert, you notice he doesn't really refute what the LAO says, what CalPERS
I'll talk
says,
about that.
what the AIDS,
I'll
healthcare,
talk about
that.
what HIV and AIDS groups say, because they've all raised questions about the policy. This is about the policy. This is about Proposition 61. Will it work? And will the details work out the way Gary says? No. They all say no. They all say they're highly uncertain, that CalPERS said it'll
Right.
lead to decreased access to drugs, that it'll increase CalPERS administrative costs. I mean, it's great to talk in big platitudes and say, trust me, Prop 61 will work. That is not what the experts are saying.
Speak to that element then, because that again is another theme, the access to drugs themselves and the prospect if Prop 61 passes, and I'll come back to you, Gary, but since you raised it, this idea that there could be reduced access to
Right.
particular drugs through this.
CalPERS is worried about that very reason, because CalPERS, unlike the Medi-Cal fee-for-service program, which could face higher costs because they have to buy the drugs no matter what the price. That's why the LAO says that the state could pay higher costs, not lower, if 61 passes. CalPERS is not under a federal mandate. And remember, this is a negotiation. This initiative sets up a negotiation. It says that the state cannot sign contracts unless the price of the drug is the same as or lower than the VA. Well, if CalPERS can't, and the companies can't reach an agreement, they can't buy the drug. That is the problem that CalPERS is worried about, and that is what Proposition 61 sets up. They could have drafted something different that wouldn't have resulted in that unintended consequence. And this is why I say details matter, and the 200 groups that are opposed are concerned about the unintended consequences.
Could you speak to that piece on reducive access to drugs as we head into our last minute here, that one of the themes that you hear in some of the no op-eds is that it would invalidate existing drug contracts that are possessed by CalPERS, Medi-Cal.
Sure, but I want to address LAO for a moment because she's referred to it about 16 times up here. What the LAO report, and you could read it in your ballot statement, in your ballot pamphlet, folks. What the LAO actually said, and this is their term, that Prop 61 could provide significant annual savings to the state. Significant annual savings to the state. And even if it reduced drug prices by 1 or 2%, could result in tens upon tens of millions of dollars of savings to the state. The reason they couldn't quantify it totally, and you can go back and you can read their analysis in your voter pamphlet, which you all have now,
Right.
was because of the uncertainty about the bad players in the drug industry and how they would try to circumvent and subvert the law. They spend paragraphs talking about what the drug companies
Right.
could try to do to subvert this law, okay? The bad player here is not Prop 61. The bad player here is not LAO. The bad players are the drug companies that have now put up $106 million to beat this thing.
We're going to have to leave it there. Please read your ballot information packets completely, and thanks you to both Gary and Kathy. Thank you.
very
Thank
much.
you.